2 freezing children, a man who had ordered people to disappear, and one night that neither side was ever supposed to survive. This is not a story about kindness. It's a story about what happens when the hardest man in the room chooses. By the time this story ends, you'll understand why the most dangerous man in the city spent 15 years protecting 2 boys he barely knew, and why, when everything fell apart, those same boys were the only people on Earth who could save his family. Chicago does not forgive weakness. It never has. It's a city that tests people the moment they arrive, with its cold, its noise, its indifference. And it keeps testing until you either adapt or disappear. J1 Shin arrived at 17 with $40, no English, and a single phone number written on a folded piece of paper tucked inside his jacket. The number belonged to a distant cousin who didn't pick up. He didn't go back. He found work in a kitchen on the north side. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, in heat that would have broken most grown men. He was not most men. He was 17, alone, and already learning the most important lesson Chicago had to teach. The city rewards the people who refuse to ask for permission. By the time he was 22, he wasn't washing dishes anymore. By 25, he was managing 2 restaurants that didn't entirely exist on paper. By 30, the men around him had stopped using his first name. They called him Hyungnim, elder brother, a term of respect in Korean culture. And in the world J1 moved through, respect was not given. It was extracted. He had spent 30 years building a life on a single rule: keep moving. On the night of February 9th, he broke it, and nothing that came after was ever the same. To the restaurant owners and nightclub operators across Koreatown, J1 Shin was a businessman, sharp, reliable, and generous when he needed to be. To the Chicago Police Department, he was a name that appeared in reports but never in courtrooms. To the men beneath him, he was the reason things ran the way they ran, quietly, efficiently, and without the kind of public disruption that attracted attention nobody wanted. What J1 built over 2 decades was not chaos. Chaos is expensive. What J1 built was order, a parallel structure that operated underneath the city's legitimate surface, with its own rules, its own courts, its own consequences. He was not reckless. He was precise. He had a wife named Soo-Jean, a woman who had grown up in Seoul, come to Chicago for graduate school, and met J1 at a mutual friend's dinner party when she was 28. She knew enough. She had made a deliberate choice about how much more she wanted to know. She had given up a research position in Seoul to follow a life in Chicago she hadn't entirely chosen. She had never said so. That was also a choice. They had 1 daughter, Hannah, 7 years old at the time this story begins. She thought her father ran a restaurant company. In a way, he did. Every Sunday, without fail, J1 called his mother in Busan. He spoke to her for exactly 30 minutes. She asked how he was eating. He told her he was eating well. Neither of them talked about anything that mattered. Those 30 minutes were the most honest part of his week. That is the man who, on the night of February 9th, was being driven down an empty street in the middle of the worst blizzard Chicago had seen in 11 years, and told his driver to stop. February in Chicago is not a season. It's an endurance test. The cold doesn't arrive gradually. It lands and stays, pressing down with the specific indifference of a city that does not care whether you make it through the night. On February 9th, the temperature dropped to -17. Wind chill pushed it past -30. The blizzard had been forecast for 3 days. Schools had already closed. Streets were emptied. The city had essentially told its people, get inside and stay there. Andre and Deshaun Carter were 11 years old. They were twins, and they had nowhere inside to go. They had been living in an abandoned building 3 blocks from the corner of West Lawrence and North Kedzie for 6 weeks. An old commercial property, a former dry cleaner, with broken windows on the 2nd floor that someone had partially covered with cardboard. They had been sleeping on the ground floor, where the windows were intact and the cold was manageable, or had been until it wasn't. No running water. A space heater they'd found in a dumpster that worked only when it felt like it. 6 weeks. 11 years old. On the night of the blizzard, the building's ground floor had flooded. A burst pipe, frozen and then ruptured, making the space they'd been sleeping in uninhabitable. The doorway on the corner was the best option they had left. Their mother, Renee Carter, had been gone for 4 days. Gone in the way that a woman goes when she's been losing a fight against addiction for years, and one morning understands that the next loss will be the last one. She hadn't planned to leave. She hadn't packed. She had simply reached a point, and she had moved toward the only thing she thought might save her before she couldn't be saved at all. Andre and Deshawn didn't know any of that. They knew she was gone. They knew they had $43 between them. They knew the space heater had stopped working the night before. And they knew that the blizzard the news had been warning about for 3 days had arrived. They had found the doorway on the corner, a recessed commercial entrance, maybe 4 feet deep, sometime around 9 in the evening. It blocked the wind from the north. It was the best option they had. J1's car moved through streets that were essentially empty. His driver, a man named Byung-soo who had been with him for nearly a decade, was taking him back from a meeting on the west side. They were not in a hurry. There was nowhere to be. Byung-soo almost didn't see them. 2 shapes in a doorway. Small. Still. So still that for a moment he thought they were bags, discarded clothing, maybe, the kind of thing you see on winter streets and train yourself not to look at too long. Then one of the shapes moved. Stop the car. Byung-soo pulled over. He looked at J1 in the rearview mirror. J1 was already opening the door. What did J1 Shin see when he walked up to that doorway? 2 boys. Thin. Underdressed in a way that told the whole story without a single word. The older twin, Andre, by 4 minutes, had his arms wrapped around his brother. Deshawn had stopped shivering. That's when cold stops being uncomfortable and starts being dangerous. J1 crouched down. He looked at them for a moment. Then he said, in English that still carried the shape of Korean underneath it, "Can you walk?" Andre looked at him. A grown man in a black coat, crouching in the snow, at 9:30 at night, on an empty street. Every instinct an 11-year-old living on his own for 6 weeks had developed told him not to trust that. Every instinct. He said, "Where are we going?" J1 said, "Somewhere warm." He picked Deshawn up off the ground and carried him to the car. He did not take them to a hospital. He did not call the police. He did not call a shelter. He told Byung-soo to drive home. Soo-jin opened the door. She looked at her husband. She looked at the 2 boys behind him. One barely able to stand, the other watching her with the measured caution of a child who had learned that adults were not always safe. She looked back at J1. He said nothing. He didn't explain. He just stepped aside. Soo-jin ran a bath. She found clothes, too large but warm. She made food. She did not ask a single question. Not that night. J1 sat at the kitchen table, across from 2 boys who were slowly becoming warm again, who were eating like they hadn't eaten properly in days. Because they hadn't. He watched them, said very little. When Deshawn finished eating, he put his head down on the table and fell asleep where he Saturday. Andre stayed awake. He looked at J1 across the table and asked the only question that mattered. "Are you going to call someone?" J1 said, "Not tonight." Andre nodded. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything. For the first time in 6 weeks, Andre and Deshawn Carter slept in a bed, with heat, with full stomachs, in a house where someone had chosen, without explanation, to let them stay. Renee Carter was not difficult to find. Not for a man with J1's resources. Within 48 hours he knew where she was, how she'd gotten there, and what she was trying to do. He had lain awake the night before, not planning, just sitting with something he hadn't been able to name since the doorway. Somewhere in those 2 boys, in their stillness, their refusal to collapse when collapse would have been understandable, he had seen himself. 17 years old. $40. A phone number that didn't answer. He wasn't ready to say it out loud, but he didn't need to say it to act on it. She was in a residential treatment facility in Indianapolis. She had checked herself in 4 days earlier, called a cousin she hadn't spoken to in 3 years, told him she was done trying to manage it alone, and asked him to drive her. He did. She entered the program the same night. She had planned to be back in 30 days. She had not told the boys because she had failed before. Twice. She wasn't abandoning them. She was trying, in the most broken way possible, to come back to them whole. J1 did not call her. He did not contact the facility. He did not threaten her, pressure her, or send anyone to her door. He paid, anonymously, through a routing so layered it was untraceable, for her program to continue as long as it needed to. Then he told Sujin the full story. Sujin listened. She asked 2 questions. The first was, "Are they safe?" The second was, "What do they need?" She did not ask how long. She did not ask what it meant for their household, their routine, their life. She asked what the boys needed. 30 days became 60. 60 became 4 months. The treatment facility's own timeline. J1 enrolled Andre and Deshawn in school, using a cousin's address on the north side. Quietly, carefully, without a paper trail that would invite questions he couldn't answer. He arranged for a legal guardian status through a contact who owed him more than money. It was not legal in any clean sense. He knew that. He did it anyway, because the alternative was a system that would separate the boys, process them, and return them to nothing. He weighed the costs and made the call he could live with. And something began to happen that J1 had not planned for. He did not sit with them and talk about feelings. He did not tell them stories or play games or do the things that people picture when they picture a father figure. What he did was show up, consistently, without announcement. He checked homework the way he reviewed contracts, with complete attention and a refusal to accept less than the work someone was capable of. If Andre turned in something careless, J1 didn't raise his voice. He simply placed it back on the table and said, "Again," not because he was harsh. One winter, Andre came home with a failing grade on an exam he hadn't studied for. J1 didn't speak to him about it. He simply placed a study schedule on his desk the next morning, waited and annotated, the way he would have prepared a contract. Andre sat down and worked through it without a word. That was the whole conversation. Hannah, his 7-year-old daughter, had no philosophical adjustment to make. She simply decided, within approximately 2 weeks, that Andre and Deshawn were her brothers. She announced this at dinner one evening as a statement of fact. Nobody corrected her. 4 months after that February night, Renee Carter completed her program. She was clean. She had work, an administrative position at a logistics company on the south side, arranged through a contact she'd made at the facility. She had a small apartment. She had rebuilt, carefully and with the specific determination of someone who had been to the bottom and understood exactly how they'd gotten there. She wanted her boys. There was a conversation between Renee and J1. It took place at a neutral location, a diner on the west side, a Tuesday morning before the lunch crowd. It lasted just under an hour. What passed between them in that hour stayed in that room. What came out of it was this. Andre and Deshawn would live with their mother. That was not a negotiation. That was the outcome. But they would spend every weekend, every school break, every holiday they chose, with J1's family. No legal document. No formal arrangement. A handshake between 2 people who, despite coming from completely different worlds, had arrived at the same position. Those boys mattered more than either of their egos. Renee Carter, for her part, never pretended she wasn't grateful. But she also never let gratitude become debt. She was their mother. He was something else. Something that didn't have a clean name in English or Korean. And they both left it unnamed because naming it would have made it smaller than it was. For almost a decade, that arrangement held. Andre and Deshawn Carter grew up belonging to 2 worlds, and they carried both of them without apparent conflict. They were their mother's sons, resilient, grounded, shaped by everything she had come back from. And they were also shaped by those weekends, those dinners, those years of being held to a standard by a man who communicated almost exclusively through expectation. By high school, Andre had decided he wanted to work in law enforcement. He never explained this directly to J1. He didn't have to. J1 heard it, said nothing for a long moment, then said, "Do it properly." That was all. Neither of them said what they both understood. That the path Andre was choosing would eventually put him in rooms where J1's name appeared in files. They left that understanding where it was. Deshawn went a different direction, drawn toward people, toward conflict, toward the space between opposing forces where most people didn't want to stand. He would eventually spend 3 years in Seoul as part of an international academic exchange, studying conflict de-escalation at the institutional level. That 3-year exchange was his first time in Seoul. It would not be his last. He came back speaking Korean fluently enough that J1's mother, on one of those Sunday calls, asked if she could speak to the black boy who talks like he grew up in Busan. Deshawn talked to her for 20 minutes. Afterward, she told J1, "That one has a good heart." J1 said, "I know, Iyama." They grew up. They built lives. The thread between all of them held. Not because anyone forced it, but because some bonds form in conditions so extreme that they don't require maintenance. They simply exist. And then, 15 years after that blizzard, when Andre was 26 and working federal organized crime cases in Chicago, and Deshawn had just returned from his second trip to Seoul, something moved. Quietly, from very far away, in a direction nobody in that kitchen, on that February night, could have anticipated. And J1 Shin, who had survived 20 years in a world that consumed most of the people who entered it, found himself in a position he had never once been in before. Cornered. There is a particular kind of threat that experienced men fear most. Not the loud one, not the dramatic one, the quiet one, the one that has already been 3 moves ahead of you before you noticed it was playing. The organization that moved on J1's territory did not announce itself. It didn't need to. It had been embedding quietly for 2 years, buying influence through legitimate business investments, placing people inside existing operations, building pressure from below before applying it from above. By the time J1 had a complete picture of what was happening, the picture was already nearly finished. They came out of Seoul, not street level, institutional, the kind of organization that had learned over decades to operate with the precision of a legal firm and the patience of people who thought in years, not months. They were not interested in violence as a first instrument. Violence was expensive and drew attention. They preferred architecture, building structures of dependency and obligation until the person they wanted to move simply had nowhere left to stand. Their message to J1 was delivered through a third party, a lawyer, technically, though the word barely applied, on a Wednesday afternoon. It was brief. J1 would step aside, transfer operational control of his territory and the network of relationships he'd spent 20 years constructing. In return, he and his family would not be touched. And then the lawyer placed a photograph on the table. It was Hannah, walking out of her graduate school building at Northwestern. The timestamp on the photograph was from 2 days earlier. J1 looked at the photograph for a long time. He picked it up. He placed it in his jacket pocket. He stood up, said nothing, and left. His assistant noted that when he returned to his office, he sat at his desk and stared at the wall for 11 minutes without moving. She had worked for him for 9 years. She had never seen him sit still for more than 30 seconds. The options available to J1 were, on examination, almost none. He could not go to law enforcement. 20 years of operation meant that any honest conversation with police would unravel not just his own exposure, but the lives of people. Shop owners, families, low-level workers, who had operated under his structure in good faith and had no capacity to absorb what that unraveling would do to them. He could not fight directly. The Seoul organization had relationships at levels above anything J1 could effectively counter with force. A direct confrontation would damage the people who had nothing to do with any of it. The ordinary Koreatown residents who had no part in any of it and no means to survive what a war between organizations would cost them. Then the second piece arrived. One of his most trusted lieutenants, a man he had pulled out of difficult circumstances 15 years earlier, a man who had eaten at his table, had been turned. When he confirmed the second name, he sat with it for a long moment. These were not strangers. These were people he had chosen. The architecture he had spent 20 years building had been entered from the inside. He didn't know how many more had gone. He had no way to know. He had resources, intelligence, and 30 years of survival instinct. And for the first time since he was a 17-year-old with $40 and a phone number that didn't answer, he had no clear path forward. He did not panic. That needs to be said. J1 Shin was not the kind of man who panicked. But he was, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely still. And in that stillness, before he had formed a plan, before he had worked through even the beginning of a strategy, his phone rang. Deshawn had been tracking the organization's Chicago timeline for weeks. That morning, a contact in Seoul had flagged an acceleration. The group was moving faster than the pattern suggested. Deshawn had called Andre. They had agreed today. Unknown number. He answered. The voice on the other end was calm, young, and it said 4 words that J1 had not heard from that voice in almost 3 months. We already know Hyungnim. Deshawn Carter. How? That question hit J1 before any other. How did he know? How much did he know? And what did it mean that he was calling now, today, within hours of the meeting with the lawyer? With that specific phrase, in Korean, using a title that meant elder brother. The answer to all 3 questions was more complicated than J1 was prepared for. And the answer involved his brother. Andre Carter had spent 8 years as a federal investigator. Organized crime and financial crimes. The unit that worked the long cases. The ones that took years to build and required an almost inhuman patience. He was, by every account from colleagues who had no reason to be generous, exceptional at it. He had known for years what J1 was. Not suspicion. Knowledge. The kind that accumulates quietly when you work in the field he worked in, and you know what to look for. He had disclosed the connection to his supervisors early. Not all of it, but enough. When the case moved into its final phase and his involvement became necessary, he went back to them with the rest. All of it. He documented every conversation. His supervisors made a decision. His knowledge was too specific to exclude. He was authorized to participate with full oversight. It cost him something, a kind of professional innocence he had carefully maintained for 8 years. He paid it without negotiating. Deshawn's path was different. He had spent 3 years in Seoul studying conflict de-escalation, working with institutions, international organizations, and eventually monitoring groups that tracked the movement of organized networks across borders. He had not gone to Seoul because of J1, but Seoul had taught him things that, in retrospect, made what was happening in Chicago readable to him before it was readable to almost anyone else. He had contacts, academic ones primarily. People inside monitoring organizations who tracked the particular group now moving on J1's territory. He had been watching their Chicago activity for 4 months. Not because of J1 initially, but because their pattern matched a case study he had presented at a conference in Oslo, and he was watching it develop the way you watch whether you recognize. And then, 3 weeks before the lawyer put that photograph on the table, Deshawn had realized the target. He called Andre. That conversation lasted 2 hours. Most of it cannot be described here. Not because it was secret, but because the weight of it doesn't compress well. 2 brothers, raised between 2 worlds, sitting on opposite ends of a phone call, working through what it meant that the man who had carried them out of a blizzard was now in the crosshairs of something neither of them had the power to stop alone. Andre said at one point, "I can't pretend I don't know what he is." Deshawn said, "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you what he is to us." They called J1 together. Deshawn spoke first because his Korean was better and because he understood, instinctively, that the way into J1's trust in a moment like this was not through leverage. It was through recognition. J1 listened. He did not speak for the first 4 minutes of the call. He let them lay out what they knew: Deshawn's intelligence on the Seoul organization, Andre's understanding of the federal landscape around it. Then he said, "Why are you telling me this?" Andre answered, and his answer was the most precise thing he had said in 8 years of federal work. He said, "Because there's a path through this that doesn't end with Hannah getting hurt and you spending the rest of your life in a cell. But it requires you to trust us. And it requires you to understand that what I'm about to offer you is not something I can offer you twice." The proposal was this: the Seoul organization was not J1's problem alone. It had been the primary target of an international investigation for 14 months, one that Andre's unit was adjacent to, and that Deshawn's monitoring contacts fed information into. The investigation needed one thing it hadn't been able to get: interior intelligence on the group's Chicago operational structure. Who they'd turned, how they'd moved, what the architecture of their pressure campaign looked like from the inside. J1 had that. He was, at this moment, the person who knew the most about how they operated in this city, because he was the one they were operating against. In exchange for that intelligence, structured carefully, delivered through channels that Andre knew how to navigate, J1's family would receive federal protection during the operation's final phase. And J1 himself would be offered a negotiated exit. Not immunity, not erasure, a structured, supervised withdrawal from his operation, with conditions, with oversight, with consequences for his people minimized to the extent the law allowed. It was not a clean offer. It was not a comfortable offer. It required J1 to surrender the structure he had spent his adult life building, and to do it not because he was forced to, but because he chose to. Deshawn said, "We're not asking you to be something you're not, Hyungnim. We're asking you to choose your family over your territory. We think you already know which one matters more. We're just here to make sure you have somewhere to step when you're ready to step." J1 told them he needed time to think. He had 12 hours. What he did in those 12 hours was not what anyone expected. The first thing J1 Shin did after he ended the call was sit in his car in a parking structure on Michigan Avenue for 40 minutes. Alone. Byung-soo waited outside the vehicle without being asked. What was he doing in there? He has been asked this. His answer each time is the same. I was finishing something. Nobody has pushed him further on that. Maybe because the answer, as incomplete as it is, feels accurate. The second thing he did, and this is the one that mattered most, the one that everything else flowed from, was call Soo-jin. Not to tell her a version of what was happening. To tell her all of it. 20 years of it. The architecture, the relationships, the decisions, the costs. Everything she had chosen over 3 decades of marriage, not to ask about directly. He sat in that parking structure, and he told his wife the truth. The call lasted 90 minutes. Soo-jin did not speak for long stretches of it. When she did, she asked clarifying questions. Specific, precise questions. The questions of someone who had spent 30 years being intelligent enough to understand more than she was told, and was now finally being given permission to understand all of it. At one point she asked about a specific property, a name J1 had mentioned casually at a dinner party 8 years earlier, a name she had filed away without comment. He told her the truth about it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I already knew. I just needed you to say it." He didn't ask how she knew. They both understood that the question didn't matter anymore. At the end, she said, "How long have you wanted to put it down?" J1 didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Longer than I knew until just now." She said, "Then put it down. We'll figure out the rest." The third thing J1 did was call his remaining loyal lieutenants. Not to strategize. Not to plan a counter-move. He called them to begin the careful, methodical process of dissolving the operational structure himself, from the top, on his own terms, before it was taken from him. This is the part of the story that gets simplified in every retelling, so it deserves a moment. What J1 did over the following 72 hours was not simply cooperate with authorities. It was a precise, layered process of unwinding 20 years of interdependency, making sure the people who had worked in lower-level positions, the ones who had the least power and the least knowledge, were insulated from the consequences of what was at the top. He leveraged every relationship he had, called in every obligation he was owed, to minimize the blast radius. He could not protect everyone. He has never claimed otherwise. But he protected as many as he could. Andre worked from the federal side, navigating the bureaucratic and legal architecture of what was being offered, making sure the protections promised were real protections, and not the kind that dissolve when the case is won and the paperwork is filed and the people who made the promises have moved on to the next file. He lost sleep over this. He has said as much. He walked a line that he knew in the moment might define or end his career. He walked it anyway. Deshawn flew to Chicago. He had one meeting to attend, and it was the most dangerous hour of this entire story. The Seoul organization's Chicago representative had agreed to a mediation session. They believed they were meeting with a neutral third party, a community conflict mediator brought in by a local business coalition concerned about the instability that had entered the neighborhood. They did not know Deshawn's connection to J1. They did not know his connection to Andre. Deshawn's academic profile was clean and verifiable. 3 years of published conflict resolution work, conference presentations across 4 countries. No visible connection to organized crime in any jurisdiction. The organization checked. What they found was exactly what Deshawn had spent a decade building, a record that could survive scrutiny. They did not know that the information he gathered in that room would be transmitted within hours to a federal task force that had been waiting 14 months for exactly this. Deshawn sat across a table from a man whose organization had put a photograph of a 22-year-old woman on a table to communicate what they were capable of. He smiled at appropriate moments. He asked careful, open-ended questions, the kind that a skilled mediator asks. He kept his voice level. He took notes on a yellow legal pad. He thanked them for their time. He had kept his hands still on the table the entire time. That was the thing he remembered afterward. Not what was said, not the specific questions, but the fact that his hands had not moved. He had learned that from years of watching J1 across dinner tables. Stillness as discipline. Stillness as information withheld. He said later that the entire time he was in that room, he thought about one thing. The doorway on West Lawrence. The cold. The moment before J1's car stopped. The specific feeling of not knowing whether help was coming, or whether you were simply going to run out of time. I survived that night, he said. I could survive that room. The federal operation moved within 60 hours of Deshawn's meeting. The Seoul organization's Chicago leadership was taken on charges that had been carefully constructed to hold. Not rushed, not improvised, but charges that had been building for over a year and needed only the final structural intelligence that J1's cooperation provided. Hannah was never touched. She was never aware of how close it came. On the morning after the arrests, J1 Shin sat in his kitchen. The same kitchen where, 15 years earlier, 2 half-frozen children had eaten soup at his table and fallen asleep before they finished. He sat there for a long time. The kitchen was the same as it always was. The same light over the table, the same chairs, the same window facing east where the morning came in gray and slow. He looked at the chair where Deshawn had fallen asleep at the table 15 years ago. He looked at the chair where Andre had sat across from him and asked, "Are you going to call someone?" He had not answered that question honestly. He understood now that the boy had known it. And then Sujin came in, put a cup of tea in front of him, and sat down across from him. Neither of them said anything. It was over. Not just the threat, the life. J1 Shin did not go to prison. The negotiated arrangement held. It was not simple, and it was not without cost. Significant financial assets were surrendered, certain properties were transferred, and J1 agreed to a period of supervised compliance that amounted to a quiet, monitored withdrawal from every room he had once occupied. There were conditions. There was oversight. There were moments in the process that were, by his own description, humbling in ways that 20 years of power had not prepared him for. But he went home, every night, to Sujin, to a life that was, by every external measure, smaller than what he'd had. He had chosen to make it smaller. That was the part nobody outside that kitchen would ever fully understand. He hadn't been reduced. He had put something down, deliberately on purpose, with both hands, and walked away from it. For the first time in 30 years, the most controlled thing he had ever done was surrender. He opened a restaurant. A real one, small, north side, 30 seats, a menu that Sujin designed, and that he executes with the same precision he once applied to everything else. He is not a warm host. The food is exceptional. The restaurant is always full. The regulars have learned not to expect conversation, but they come back because the place feels deliberate, like nothing was left to chance. His mother, in Busan, thinks he finally got out of the restaurant management business and into the restaurant business. He has not corrected her. Byung-soo was not among those who were turned. He was among those J1 protected during the dissolution, insulated from the consequences, given a clean exit, set up with a stake in a legitimate transport business on the north side. He did not ask for an explanation. He had driven for J1 long enough to understand that explanations, in their world, had always been optional. Hannah finished her graduate degree in urban planning. 6 months after the arrests, after everything had settled and the legal dust had cleared, J1 sat down with his daughter and told her the truth. Not all of it at once, but enough. The shape of it, the real story of what he had been and what those years had cost and what he had ultimately chosen. She didn't speak to him for 3 weeks. Then she called. She didn't announce that she had forgiven him. She didn't make a speech about understanding. She just said, "Are you busy Friday? I want to have dinner." They have dinner every Friday. The first Friday, she arrived before he did. He found her already seated, reading the menu she had memorized years ago. He sat down across from her. Neither of them mentioned the 3 weeks of silence. They ordered. They ate. That was enough. Andre continued his career. The case, built over 14 months and completed in a final 72-hour window, became one of the most significant organized crime prosecutions of the decade. His name appears in the case files. His personal connection to any of it does not. He ensured that with the same exhaustive documentation he had applied to everything else. He was promoted the following year. His supervisor, in the evaluation, wrote that Andre Carter possessed an unusual capacity to remain objective in circumstances where most investigators would lose perspective. The supervisor did not know what he was actually describing. He keeps a single document in a locked folder on his personal computer, not his work machine. It contains everything he disclosed, everything he withheld, every decision he made in those 72 hours, annotated in his own handwriting. He has never shown it to anyone. He doesn't intend to, but he updates it occasionally when something shifts in his memory of those days. It is the most honest thing he has ever written. Deshawn went back to his work. He speaks, occasionally, at conferences and community programs, about the complexity of identity, about belonging to multiple worlds simultaneously, about what it means to stand in the space between opposing forces and hold your ground without becoming something you didn't choose to be. He never uses names. He never tells the story directly. The week after the operation closed, he drove to the corner of West Lawrence and North Kedzie. He parked. He sat in the car for a while, looking at the doorway. Then he drove home. Renee Carter is 15 years clean. She retired from the logistics company and now works as an intake coordinator at a residential treatment facility on the south side of Chicago. She calls Sujin on birthdays. She sees her sons every week. She does not talk about the 4 days often. When she does, it is with the specific precision of someone who has examined a thing so thoroughly that it no longer has the power to surprise her. She knows exactly what happened. She knows exactly why. And she has made her peace with both, not the peace of forgetting, but the harder kind. She and J1 have spoken perhaps a dozen times since that diner meeting years ago. They are not close. They do not need to be. They share something that doesn't require proximity. The specific understanding of two people who both made irreversible decisions for the same children and somehow, improbably, both made the right one. And 15 years later, because he stopped, two men were in a position to do something that no one else on earth could have done. Because of who they were. Because of who he had been to them. He stopped because he saw himself. Not a memory of himself. Himself, present tense, in that doorway. 17 years old. $40. A phone number that didn't answer. The cold. The specific quality of not knowing whether the night was going to end, or whether you were simply going to run out of it. He had never said this to anyone in plain language. But it was the only true answer to the question the whole story orbits. He stopped because he recognized the doorway. He had been in it. I think what happened is that one man, on one night, chose to be accountable to something larger than his own survival. And that choice, that one unrepeatable, illogical choice, echoed forward for 15 years and came back to him exactly when he needed it most. The question is never whether someone deserves to be saved. The question is whether you'll be the one who stops. Has there been a moment in your life, one decision, one choice to stop when everything said keep moving, that changed the direction of everything that came after? I'd genuinely like to know. Tell me in the comments.